Discussion talk show. Today, I am joined by Chris Lewis.
Hi, my name is Chris Lewis from Chicago, Illinois, and I'm an egoist today.
Chase Harris.
I'm Chase, coming to you from New York City, and I'm a classical liberal center-left.
Okay, Swaroop Bhagavatula.
Hi, I'm Swaroop. I live in Houston right now, and I'm a libertarian.
Okay, and I'm Amir Naji, coming to you from New York, and I'm a Georgist. So our topic for today is climate change. So we have just a few questions, and we'll kind of just go through them informally, kind of round-robin fashion, or however we want to kind of do this. So let's get started. So now that we're at a stage where science is fairly robust, what are the relevant political factors that should determine what we do about climate change? Anyone want to start?
Sure, yeah, I can take that. I think there's definitely a lot of political factors to pay attention to. Like, obviously, healthcare is something that is directly impacted by climate change. And you got other stuff like national security. Like, there are certain solutions to climate change where we may or may not need to be concerned about national security and that kind of stuff. Just to throw out a couple, if anybody wants to run with any of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's with climate change. I think one of the biggest political issues, of course, is with industry. Big industrial giants see climate change, and I think they see climate change as kind of a risk to profit. And despite evidence showcasing that the issues that climate change brings about to the world. At the end of the day, I think profit really wins out in the minds of a lot of people, and I think also in the individual level, I think a lot of people see it as kind of a limitation. It's like everyone kind of wants to do their own thing. There's individual rational decision making, which but sometimes doesn't translate into the global optimum for society. So
I also think that the idea of sequestration, right? Like, you get emissions to zero, but then what do you do about the CO2 in the atmosphere? Nobody really has a plan for that, right? Like, ultimately, the reason you care about carbon emissions is that it accumulates and then it warms the planet. So I feel like that should be our biggest concern now, rather than emissions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, but I think that sort of responsibility comes down to the people who are doing research on solutions to climate change. And I think that's a valid thing to talk about, but I think it's separate from the political aspect of things, because you can't really make political policy saying like, hey, you should research this. I mean, I guess you could incentivize certain types of research, but
you could incentivize people to capture the carbon from their emissions. Like, you could say, okay, if you capture your gasoline exhaust or something, like, we could collect it and then reuse it or something, right? Like, I think that would be a good place to start.
Right.
Carbon currency.
Yeah.
Carbon currency. A cryptocurrency based on carbon emissions.
Or lack
that sounds like it could work, but
sounds really very inflated.
Right. Well, in terms of like what people can do politically, I mean, isn't it to a point where like many scientists say that climate change is just like it's too far gone, like no matter what we do, it's like the ball is rolling and we can't stop it. Like, so I feel like
I think I heard recently that there was some report that said that they were estimating the year when it was kind of like if you don't fix this by then, you're kind of screwed after this point. I think 2017 was that year.
Yeah, like
I forgot where I read that, but
like the 500 million parts per million thing or something like that.
Yeah, maybe.
And as far as I understand the science, it's like there's definitely a threshold, like a sort of doomsday threshold, but that doesn't mean once we pass that there's no reason to keep fighting greenhouse gas emissions and things. I think it's really just a matter of how bad is it going to be, and how much time do we have to make changes.
Well, yeah.
It's a question of, yeah. So it's you get to this point where people say there's no turning back, but then if you just stop caring and you keep doing the same thing, you're just going to accelerate the process of problems.
Right,
I feel like.
And potentially make them even more catastrophic.
I think the other point, as far as politics is concerned, I feel like a big issue with this is there's kind of a focus on climate change in general. What I meant to say was there's a focus specifically on climate change when it should be more general. I don't think that we should live in a world where we don't really care about pollution or kind of put on a back burner because I guess what's happened is we kind of didn't care enough about it until we started seeing the actual effects of it, and that we're seeing kind of right now. And it kind of becomes a little too late. I think we should always be conscious of, hey, you know what, we're destroying the environment, and regardless of the immediate impact, we should probably be more proactive in combating that if we can.
I also think that it's also interesting that we always focus on vehicle emissions and industry. We never focus on meat. Like, that is a very large contributor, right? Like Norway and all these European countries, they have $10 a gallon for gas. They have Teslas, but they all eat red meat, And so I'm just very curious, like, why people are very, ready to drive a Tesla and, say I'm on a bike to work every day, but nobody's ready to give up meat.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because it's kind of like the focus is on the specific thing. It's like carbon emissions, and we talk about the more direct, more like kind of in your face contributor. But you have all these secondary things that I think you were saying before that causes more carbon emissions than actual vehicle emissions, right?
Yeah, it's particularly red meat.
Yeah. But then it goes back to like what I was saying before, like, individual rational choice. A lot of people aren't going to give up red meat so easily. If it, they don't care about the whole like global optimum. They just kind of care about like what's immediately in front of them. What is the immediate gain for them, right? So
I think that's that's part of the entire problem. It's the tragedy of the commons, because if you think about the air that we're polluting as a resource, it's not an owned resource. It's something that is sort of global, and it's in everybody's best interest to use it to their own advantage. But on a societal level, like that's a bad strategy for the group. It's the classic tragedy of the commons, and typically the like libertarian solution is to privatize whatever the commodity is, or on the sort of left end of the spectrum, to regulate it by government. But both of those solutions seem, well, you can't privatize air, and there's the government regulation aspect of it seems so overbearing that it's not going to be a politically workable solution. So, that's sort of the conundrum that we seem to be in.
Well, I think at this point, like I was saying, like, it's kind of the ball is already rolling. And then a fact that people like to bring up for the wrong reasons is that most carbon emissions, for the most part, aren't like, it's going to come from developed countries, but there's many countries that are developing many parts. I mean, just entire regions. And so that's going to produce a large amount of emissions and pollution on its own. And it's like, you can't just sweep in and tell these people like, hey, stop trying to have a better life. It's like, no. And I doubt that there's going to be, of course, as technology goes on, we're going to have greener ways to do things, greener ways to produce things. But I doubt Tesla, or if Amazon comes out with some green grocery store or something, they're just going to be like, hey, Zimbabwe, here, have some. Like, it's not going to be free. And I feel like at this point, I'm trying to remember who said it. Was it John McCain? When he was running for president, he said when he's elected, he'll make a moon base. Like, as crazy as that sounds, I feel like we're at such a point with climate change that having an off-world like settlement or something might be the best solution, because the Earth is going to change. I mean, the sea levels are going to rise, weather's going to get more extreme, and millions of people are going to be displaced. Millions of jobs are going to be destroyed. Millions of acres of farmland, arable land, is going to be gone. Like the entire world is going to have to reconfigure itself, and it's something that not one nation on Earth has ever dealt with. You know, not even modern developed humans have dealt.
It's kind of a gargantuan issue that it's difficult. There's government policy for certain things, but this is one of those things where, yeah, you can like kind of you can slow it down. I think you can definitely slow it down, but if we're at a point where there's no turning back, then
yeah, it's kind of.
What I would say to that, though, is I would say that if we do settle somewhere else, are we actually going to learn from our mistake, right?
Well, again, I believe that technology is going to make things, greener. As things go on, I feel like obviously right now it's like things like it's too late to wait for technology. It'd be foolish to wait for technology to fix, to just be like, it's okay. Once we get all these super cool factories made and it's going to be green, and then it'll stop. It's like, no, it's past that point. I feel like once we get to a point where we can move off world, technology will be to a point where it causes little to no, effect on the environment, outside of just, like clearing land and obviously killing species and stuff like that.
Right.
I mean, I feel like we should treat climate change like how, like how LA treats earthquakes, or New Orleans treats hurricanes. Like this is a disaster. It's going to happen. So we need to make bunkers or find solutions instead of trying to figure. Maybe there is a solution to fix the problem, but I haven't seen it. I haven't read it. So I feel like the best thing to do would be for governments all over the world to try and make I don't know, it would be bunkers or just ways that people can ride out this change, or ways to prepare for it.
Well, so actually that kind of leads into the second question, which is what sorts of rights, principles, regulations should be protected or affected based on our knowledge of how we interact with the environment? So, even if it's kind of a lot of the damage is already done, what can we do to slow it down, or at least try and hope that we can somehow reverse it?
Yeah, that's tough.
That's really a hard question, because something this huge and devastating that's going to change the planet, it's going to require a monumental amount of effort and, resource movement, and more than likely a centralized authority. And, a lot of people aren't going to like that, because it sounds like big government, I mean, I can see people, like, if it gets to a point where people need to prepare, like the government's like, yeah, this is happening, we need to prepare for it. I just imagine like eminent domain on steroids, just square miles, just hundreds of miles, just being, taken up by the government and used for different reasons, or testing, or bunkers, or, experimenting on a new type of plant that's going to be able to survive the change in environment. I think it would be a very extreme change, but
I mean, I was talking to Chase earlier, and we were talking about things like, carbon tax, cap and trade, those sorts of solutions to the immediate carbon footprint problem. Right? But I mean, there are other aspects of it too. You could. I was reading about nanotechnology as also another aspect to use as far as reversing, or I guess utilizing carbon emissions for more productive purposes. I guess. Sorry.
How I feel like a lot of liberals, they want to reduce carbon emissions, but not they want to reduce it a certain way. They don't like natural gas, even though it has a third of the carbon emissions. They don't like nuclear, right? They want to reduce carbon emissions, but they're excluding some very economical ways to reduce carbon emissions.
Yeah, so I mean that goes back to a lot of people think it's just like so carbon tax is one of those things that just kind of you just reduce carbon and that's it, and then but I mean subsidizing and promoting solar energy and as before a lot of people think it's a very inefficient form of energy, but it's actually gotten a lot better over the years. Nuclear power, which it's an excellent form of energy. People are just scared of the like 0.00001% chance of meltdown, right? And you get that sort of you know panic from that sort of thing. Like I said about nanotechnology, which can be utilized to convert carbon dioxide into materials that could be used for production. There's a lot of, uh, of choices that we have that not only reduces the footprint, but also ends up being a better economic inclusion.
So my question, I think, with what you had said about tax and cap and trade, I think that really is the question of like, how do we politically find a workable solution where, or maybe even culturally, that places the value of protecting the environment above the sort of principle of, capitalist economics, of freedom, of, like, where do we balance those things?
Well, I think carbon tax is just kind of a disincentive for an action, right? But what I was saying with the alternative solutions are those are uh, incentives, like economic incentives, to to expand economy and to be more productive, right? Um, and we're kind of in a time now where people are kind of like you have all these people that are trying to go back to coal or whatever when it's not the most economically uh, or environmentally correct solution, but yet you go back to that like the what I was saying before about like individual rational decision making. I care about what's in front of me, my job here, but I'm not seeing in the future in the long term like from a more holistic level, which causes a lot of problems. It's the same thing with the nuclear power where people are like individually, I'm scared about nuclear meltdown. It's the same sort of thing, right?
Mm.
Cool. Any other thoughts?
I don't know, man. I think that definitely people, uh, libertarians that just I don't know. I think that the idea of having an anarchy or Ancapistan or whatever. I feel like going into the coming age of climate change and the world changing so much, I think that government is only going to get bigger and it's going to some might collapse, but I feel like people are going to trust more into the government because again, we haven't seen things like these. So I could definitely see, like you said, a carbon tax or a tax, higher taxes in general. I mean, it could definitely be crazy. Definitely a trying time ahead. Maybe for us later in life, or maybe for our children. Definitely for our children.
No, I agree. I was actually this is kind of unrelated, but I've always wondered if this goes back to some a psychological study, a very famous one, that one of the conclusions was if you take a bunch of groups or people who are not really friendly to each other, and you have some big sort of thing that they all have to come together to fight against or something like that, they end up uniting uh, pretty well. So I've always wondered if this sort of like gargantuan situation, like the more usual example I would bring up is like if an alien species attacked, the whole world might actually come together for once to fight it because it's a much bigger enemy and it's kind of something you have to come together against. I wonder if climate change would kind of be the same sort of thing, where the whole world has to come together to fight against it, and you might actually see, like I guess what we're saying, a bigger conglomeration of government in the coming years, if it is as disastrous as we make it out to be.
I think that's a potentially nice idea, but I don't think it's realistic, because the nature of climate change is that it doesn't feel proximate to people. By the time, because we're talking about climate, climate is weather over long periods of time. We're talking, years, dozens of years, hundreds of years. And to sort of treat it as a common enemy to unite against, there's got to be something tangible for people. If you just tell people disaster is going to happen and it's going to make your children and grandchildren, live in a place that's unworkable, but it doesn't really change what's in front of you right now, I don't think people are going to pay attention to it. I don't see that as a socially workable solution to, get everybody to unite.
I could see it.
Oh, go ahead.
Maybe if we look at it in the same vein as what's recently happened with all the hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, just powerful hurricane after powerful hurricane after powerful hurricane. I no doubt believe that wasn't climate change trending on Twitter? Like, it's like people, the more disasters like these happen, the more obvious that it's going to be like, this is obviously a problem that's only going to get worse with time. I mean, how long until, I don't know how it is in New York, but here in Chicago, there's this really bad mix of Lake Michigan and just bad building, or just aging buildings and foundations, to where, like, I mean, at one point, like, old tunnels beneath the city, it's like the dirt got so saturated with water that the water bursted into the old tunnels, and then it started to threaten the foundations of like skyscrapers and stuff. And I know many coastal cities are built on, at least the older ones are built on, older versions of the city. So, I mean, how crazy would it be for just, people? I mean, we already have a problem with just aging bridges, bad roads, just shoddy infrastructure in general. But mix that in with the weather, it's going to get more and more common. And then what? Hurricane Sandy happened, like 5 years ago. So, yeah. I mean, what happens when a Harvey hits New York? Houston, it's terrible what happened, but to be completely honest, Houston is Houston. When you have a major, basically the icon of America, the icon of the West in New York, almost being obliterated by a hurricane, it's the idea that people are going to be like, yo, okay, so this is obviously a problem and it's going to get way worse. So maybe we need to be significantly more proactive about this. Now, I don't see like a world government like type thing where everybody unites. The best I could see is just countries allowing, scientists to interact more, sharing research more, getting closer in relations, trying to come together and find a similar solution through, like, science, instead of like, hey guys, we're going to become Earth, the country. So, yeah.
So it might even be an education issue at that point.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, and I guess my only point with that was that, yeah, I think a giant hurricane hitting New York would bring people together, but not in time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it would be at the point where people will start caring, but it would be even more like too late to actually start doing something about it, right?
Right.
It's actually kind of sad, because humans tend to be very bad at, like, I feel like we all always tend to think in the short term, like what's in front of us, what is immediately the most beneficial to us, but not long term. So these sorts of issues are just, it's kind of, it's just how it is, But yeah, I mean, even things about like a few weeks ago here in New York, we had like a really cold period of time, and everyone was complaining about climate change, right? I'm wondering how much that like complaint about climate change actually goes into actually doing something about it, though, right? I'm not going to pretend I don't do the same thing. Like I'm not, I might like make a joke about climate change, but I don't know what I'm personally doing to improve the state. But that's kind of the other thing, right? It's like it's kind of something that we sort of joke about, but it's because the effects aren't immediately like disastrous and apparent to us, but at least having that awareness is there in a sense.
Most definitely.
Cool. So one final question. I think we can wrap it up. What do you think is often missed in discourse about climate science and policy?
I think right off the bat, for me, that's easy. I think people are arguing from a perspective that they should have lost 30, 40 years ago. And that's basically people are arguing about whether the science is correct. People are missing the fact that like the science is in. Like, okay, yeah, we might have some small details to work out and refine, and that's the nature of the scientific process. But right now, it's not down to whether climate change is caused by people, or even to a large extent how much is caused by people. It's really down to what can we do about it, how long is it going to take, and how effective can we be.
Yeah. When people talk about it, generally from what I've seen, nobody really talks about, you always hear, oh my God, rising sea levels. But I mean, does anybody really sit down and just think about how devastating that would be socially and economically? I mean, most of America's major cities, like 70% of them are on the coast. So, and what, two of America's most populous cities, or out of the top three, are on the coast, LA and New York. I mean, New York already has a flooding problem. So it's, people never really grasp. I feel like people get so wrapped up in like Chase said that about, oh, is it real or not? Is it really not, that people don't really understand it? Like, yeah, it's real. Of course, people aren't going to be able to tell you like what date and time, at this date and time, it's going to rise exactly 2 feet. Well, no, I doubt many sciences are that accurate, but it's like, this is real enough for you to know that your kids or grandkids, your house that you're living in right now could be underwater. The city that you love could be underwater, destroyed. And the country that you supposedly like or don't like, but people you care about are in it, could have tens of millions, if not upwards of 100 million of just displaced people. So, it's just crazy. It's crazy. Like the entire topic is dismissed like by millions of people. So
Well, people don't care unless it's right in front of them, like I said, which is sad. But what can you do? All right, Roop.
Yeah. What?
Oh, so what do you think? What do you think is often missed in discourse about climate science and policy?
I don't really trust projections, because I think that, first of all, people are basing their opinion off of other people's opinions, right? So if you're basing your opinion off of facts, that's one thing. But you're saying, I'm right because somebody else is right. That's not a real opinion, right? But I think projections are also, kind of sketchy because, I read a New York Times article in 1913 where they said, the planet's going to end in, 50 years or whatever, and they were wrong. So I don't really believe in projections per se. It's okay to say that things are going to get worse, and it's okay to say that we should prepare for it. But to say that there's a doomsday date, I just don't believe it. I think that you can argue that there will come a point in time which is irreversible, but there's no way any of us can predict that.
Yeah, I mean, there's something weird about saying like, oh, after this year it's gonna be it's gonna be irreversible. But yeah, I mean, no one knows the future exactly. I mean, and there are things that have been, I guess, hopeful in a sense. Like, I was reading the headline. There's some headline I was talking to Chase about that said that the hole in the ozone in Antarctica was like shrinking or something like that. Which, I mean, in a sense, it's promising. So that for that particular thing, it doesn't negate any, like, it's not one of those things that's like, oh, some people are going to spin it as, oh, climate change is bunk. This is it's fixing itself. There's no problem. Or you have the camp of people who's like, okay, this is just like a cyclical, warm and cold cycles on Earth or whatever, right? Like I don't take those sorts of things as negating the actual science that's there and set in stone. But yeah, I mean, I think I think there are signs of hope, and I do think that there are ways that we can at least slow things down. But yeah, that's kind of how I see it. I think my biggest thing about the discourse is kind of like it's basically what everyone else said. People don't really take things like they might see the science and kind of completely ignore it because they don't personally care enough, or they're motivated by politics, and that unfortunately sways their opinion. And it's unfortunate because it's you're kind of just like shooting yourself in the foot. There's no reason not to. It's kind of and it's kind of gotten us away from the discussion about how can we address this to a discussion of is this happening or not, which I think is a complete waste of time if it's scientifically sound. So any other thoughts?
Yeah, one last thing. When I see a lot of conservative types bring up saying that hey, the earth changes every couple million years and this is natural, but I don't think they realize that when the earth changes, a lot of things die. And the reason why the things keep going is that some of the things stay alive. So it's like, yeah, I mean, climate change could happen. We could do nothing. And you're right. Humans might survive, but billions would die. So, I never really understood that, why people, it just shows like you said, an allegiance to politics. Because it's like, if you look deeper into what you're saying, that just makes it all the more scarier. Just say, hey, it's like, things are gonna die. A lot of things are gonna die. Sure, like a couple million humans are gonna survive, and we can rebuild civilization and all that type of stuff. But it's still billions are gonna die. So it's like, I mean, it's either you could be that guy, like, yeah, it's okay, humans are gonna survive, or you could be like, hey, okay, how are we gonna get the most people possible to survive? So that's my thing. All it is.
Yeah, it seems to me like a version of they're committing a version of the natural fallacy where just because something is natural, it's good, or it's not bad. But
yeah,
even from that perspective, it's an illusion because we know from the science that it's not natural.
Yeah.
Like, that's just, to me, that just seems like a weak justification for whatever your politics might tell you. Yeah.
I mean, at least it's more than like. I mean, I take that more seriously than like hoax by the Chinese, for example. So
yeah, that's true.
But that's of course relative. Okay. Any other thoughts?
Nah.
All right. So that was great. Thanks for having. Sorry. Thank you all for joining me, and yeah, thanks for talking.
Thanks for hosting here, and thanks Chris and Swaroop for joining.
Awesome. Yeah, great discussion. All right. Take care, guys.
All right.